There was a stunned silence that followed the slap on Diamond's face. It echoed through the private dinner hall. Rena stood there, her hand still out. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin this?" Rena said. "Hanul worked months for this deal. You're just a name on a contract. Get out." Diamond didn't flinch. She didn't even touch her reddening cheek. She looked at Rena with a cold, clinical indifference. "I would have slapped you back myself," Diamond said, her voice quiet and steady. "But I didn't want to soil my hands with your filth. You aren't worth the cost of the manicure." Diamond looked toward the door and raised her hand. "Hold her." 3 women in suits walked in. 2 grabbed Rena's arms and pinned her. The 3rd stood next to Diamond. Diamond looked at her. "Slap her." The guard hit Rena once. It was a heavy flat sound. Hanul stood up, shouting for Diamond to stop. Diamond didn't look at him. She just gestured to her guards. "Slap him too." The woman did as instructed, following Diamond's orders without question. After slapping Hanul twice, Diamond said, "Now slap her 4 more times." The sound of the 3rd guard's palm hitting Rena's face 4 times in rapid succession was the only thing breaking the suffocating air of the Shilla's private hall. Each strike was clinical, flat, heavy, and devoid of the frantic energy of a street fight. Diamond stood perfectly still, her shadow long against the marble floor, watching the woman who had just tried to humiliate her crumble into a heap of red silk and ruined makeup. Hanul struggled against the 2 guards holding him, his face a distorted mask of shock and wounded ego. A thin trail of blood leaked from the corner of his mouth, staining his white collar. "Diamond, stop this," he wheezed, his voice cracking. "You're making a scene in front of the Joe group. You're destroying my family's reputation. Your reputation was destroyed the moment you mistook my silence for weakness, Hanul," Diamond said. Her voice didn't rise. It carried a terrifying, low-frequency stability. "I spent a year watching you parade this woman around, Sol. You didn't just waste my time. You wasted my patience. Consider those slaps as interest on the debt you owe me." At the head of the long table, Jaewon shifted in his seat. He didn't reach for his glass. He didn't signal his own security to intervene. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes fixed on the black woman in the center of the room. He felt a sharp phantom pain in his side, the exact spot where a serrated blade had nearly ended his life 3 years ago in a rain-slicked alleyway in Gangnam. He remembered the smell of the rain and the metallic tang of his own blood. He remembered the feeling of the pavement growing cold beneath him. And then he remembered her. She hadn't been a damsel, then either. She had walked out of the shadows, wrapped her own trench coat around his torso to stanch the bleeding, and dragged him to a car with a strength that defied her frame. She hadn't asked who he was or which gang had betrayed him. She had simply looked at the wound, looked at him, and driven. She had paid the clinic in cash and vanished before the anesthesia had even worn off. For 3 years he had searched for his savior. He had checked everywhere in Gangnam, Seoul. He never expected to find her standing in the middle of a failed engagement dinner, ordering guards to dismantle a man who had begged him for months to sign this business deal. Jaewon watched the way Diamond carried herself, the straight spine, the lack of tremors in her hands. She wasn't acting out of a broken heart. She was performing a strategic amputation. He found the efficiency of it beautiful. Diamond signaled her guards to release them. The 2 women stepped back in a synchronized motion, their expressions as blank as the marble walls of the Shilla. Hanul slumped into his chair, his chest heaving as he pressed a trembling hand to his bruised jaw. On the floor, Rena was a mess of tangled hair and smudged eyeliner, her breath hitching in ragged, pathetic sobs. The aggression she had earlier had been thoroughly beaten out of her in less than 3 minutes. Diamond didn't offer her a hand. She didn't even offer a look of pity. She simply reached for the heavy silk of her skirt, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle before pulling a velvet-lined box from her clutch. She didn't open it, she just slid it across the table. It rattled against Hanul's half-empty wine glass, a final hollow sound. "The engagement is over, Hanul," Diamond said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the high-pitched heat of a woman scorned. It was the voice of a CEO closing a bad merger. "I came here to tell you this in person because I wanted to see the look on your face when you realized you've lost your only leverage. But Rena just had to be Rena, and it made it way easier for me. You can keep the ring. Sell it. Use the money to buy Rena a better personality." Hanul looked at the box, then up at Diamond, his eyes bloodshot. "You can't just end it," he rasped, his voice thick with desperation. "Our parents, the contract. Diamond, my father will ruin your family for this. You're a foreigner here. You have nothing without this alliance." Diamond's lips quirked into a sharp, mocking line. I've lived in Seoul long enough to know that an alliance with a sinking ship is just a slow suicide. She had not told him about her software company that was already cleared for an international IPO. I don't need your father's approval, and I certainly don't need a husband who presents his mistress as a business partner. Jae-won, who had remained a silent observer at the other end of the table, finally stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and immediately commanded the air in the room. He didn't look at Hanul. He didn't look at the sobbing woman on the floor. His gaze was anchored to Diamond, tracing the familiar lines of a face that had haunted his recovery for 3 years. So Hanul, Jae-won's voice cut through the room like a serrated blade. This is the pillar of strength you told me was the backbone of your family's legacy? He gestured vaguely toward Rina, his tone dripping with a lethal boredom. You brought a mistress to a Joe Group negotiation and lied to my face, claiming she was your future wife. You thought I wouldn't notice the difference between a queen and a counterfeit. Hanul scrambled to stand, nearly tripping over his own chair. Joshua, please. It was a misunderstanding. Rina is. She was a mistake, Jae-won interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. The amusement was gone, replaced by the cold authority that had made him the most feared man in the underworld. And you are a liability. The deal is dead. Your family's credit lines will be frozen by midnight. I don't do business with men who can't control their households, and I certainly don't do business with liars. Jae-won took a step toward Diamond, his eyes never leaving hers. Get out, Hanul, he commanded, though his eyes remained on Diamond. Take your trash and get out of my sight before I have my guards finish the job. Diamond started. Hanul didn't argue. He grabbed Rina by the arm, dragging her up with a rough, panicked urgency. They fled the hall without looking back, the double doors swinging shut behind them with a heavy thud that felt like a gavel coming down. As this was happening, Diamond finally looked at the man who was the audience to this madness. And then the memory clicked. As she stood her ground, her spine straight, watching Jae-won approach. She remembered the weight of him against her shoulder in that alley. She remembered the way his blood had stained her coat. She didn't move as he stopped inches away from her, the scent of expensive tobacco marking his space. Finally, Jae-won said softly, a dark, knowing glint in his eyes. I've been waiting 3 years to show my appreciation. I did not save you to get a thank you in return, Diamond said, her voice cutting through the lingering tension in the hall. I just did what anyone else would have done. Jae-won's lips quirked into a ghost of a smile, though his eyes remained sharp, tracing the faint red mark on her cheek where Rina's hand had landed. Anyone else would have called the police and let the medics handle the mess, he countered, his voice a low, gravelly hum. You dragged a dying man into a car, bypassed every state-monitored hospital, and paid a black market surgeon in cash. That isn't what anyone does, Diamond. That is what a woman who understands the value of a life does. He took a step closer, encroaching on her personal space. I don't offer thank yous. I offer debts paid in full. And right now the world is about to get very loud for you. Walk with me. Diamond didn't move. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her expression hardening. I have my own car, Jae-won. And I have a war to finish. She turned and walked out of the Shilla, the click of her heels sounding like a countdown. The air was crisp, but before she could even reach her vehicle, her phone began to vibrate violently in her clutch. The caller ID showed a number she had memorized but never wanted to see again. Chief Osei's her stepfather. She answered on the third ring, not because she wanted to talk, but because she wanted the silence to end. You've finally done it. The man's voice exploded through the speaker, thick with accent and unfiltered rage. You embarrassed Hanul's family. You destroyed the shipping merger I spent 18 months brokering. Do you have any idea what you have cost this family? I cost you a trade deal, Chief. I saved myself a lifetime of misery, Diamond replied, her voice ice cold. In the background she could hear the familiar rhythmic sound of her mother's guilt-tripping sobs. It was a performance Diamond had witnessed since she was 6 years old. She always cried whenever Diamond complained about something, which made her always feel guilty and let things be, but not anymore. Now it was just the sound of a woman who had traded her daughter's freedom for the security of a billionaire's checkbook. You are nothing, her stepfather screamed. I will revoke your visa by morning. I will pull every cent of your funding in Seoul. I will disown you and leave you on the streets of a country that doesn't even want you. You will be back in Nigeria begging for my mercy. I don't need your money, Diamond said, her grip tightening on the phone. She looked up and saw Jae-won standing by the glass doors of the hotel watching her. And you can't revoke my visa either. My residency isn't tied to your shipping company anymore. I switched my sponsorship to my own tech firm 6 months ago. Before he could reply with another threat, she hung up. She didn't wait to hear her mother's scripted plea for obedience. She blocked the number with a swift flick of her thumb. She knew her mother wouldn't call back from a different line. She only moved when the man with the checkbook gave her permission. Diamond stood in the hallway. She had just cut the last anchor to her past. She was alone, but for the first time in years she was free to do whatever she wanted. Jae-won caught up to her before she could reach her driver's side door. The click of his leather shoes on the asphalt was slow, unhurried, but it carried the weight of someone who didn't expect to be ignored. He had listened to her phone call, the cold defiance, the dismissal of her family, and the calculated move with her visa. It didn't just intrigue him, it confirmed every suspicion he'd held since the alley. He didn't lead with a romantic overture or a cliché reunion. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands in his pockets. "I saw how well you handled all this," he said, his voice level. "I don't need to hear more to get an idea of what you have been through. You're a woman who knows how to survive, Diamond. But survival is a defensive game. How about I give you a hand to sink your stepfather's and ex-fiance's business deal fully?" Diamond turned, her key fob gripped tightly in her hand. She looked at him, truly looking at him for the first time since the dinner. He is indeed handsome, she thought, with a muscular build and looking every bit like someone who has seen things. She didn't know his name or the extent of his reach, but she felt the gravity he pulled. He was either trouble or power, possibly both. "And how exactly will you do that?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. "How about we meet again?" Jae-won replied. "In a place less exposed than a hotel parking lot. I can introduce myself properly and we can plan this out. A strategic strike is better than a messy brawl." Jae-won had never liked Hanul's group. They were the scavengers of the Korean corporate world, playing dirty and betraying partners once the ink was dry. His initial reason for even sitting at that dinner table was to set a trap. A slow-acting poison to bankrupt them as revenge for a mutual associate they had ruined years ago. But finding Diamond, the savior who had appeared like a ghost in his hour of need, wanting the same destruction he did, was a variable he hadn't calculated. It was a pleasant surprise. Diamond stayed silent for a long moment. She was a woman of data and logic, and the data suggested that Hanul and her stepfather were going to coordinate a strike against her. She had the software, she had the brilliance, but she did not have enough physical and social footing to withstand a two-front war from the elite. She needed a partner who wasn't afraid of the dark. "This is my card," Diamond said, reaching into her clutch and handing him a card with her company logo. "Send me the details of the meetup. If the terms are right, we talk." Jae-won took the card, his fingers briefly brushing hers. He pulled his own card from his jacket and handed it back. "Will do," he replied, a shadow of a smile touching his face. "Till we meet again, Diamond." She didn't wait for him to open her door. She got in, started the engine and pulled away. In the rearview mirror, Jae-won stood in the middle of the parking lot, watching her taillights disappear, holding her card like it was a winning hand. The game had officially been upgraded. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. The executive office of the Joe Group smelled of aged cedar and cold authority. It was here that the terms were laid out. A strategic partnership between Diamond's tech firm and Jae-won's empire. The very deal that was supposed to be Hanul's. Diamond wasn't just bringing software to the table. She brought the background details that would incinerate the Hanul Group from the inside out. For 2 weeks she moved between her own headquarters and Jae-won's office, firing off encrypted emails and coordinating with her internal assets. She had been patient, planting 2 faithful moles months ago, one in Hanul's private residence and one in his corporate headquarters. When the office mole finally sent over a decrypted file containing a hidden ledger of illegal kickbacks, Diamond's adrenaline spiked. She tried reaching Jae-won on his secure line, but he didn't pick up. Driven by a surge of excitement, she didn't wait for a call back. She drove straight to his penthouse, the digital evidence burning a hole in her mind. They spent 3 hours hunched over a laptop in his living room, the city lights of Seoul shimmering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. As they dissected the data, the air between them grew heavy. Every time their hands brushed over the keyboard or their shoulders met while pointing at a line of code, a spark flared. They both ignored it, anchored by their mutual focus on the kill, but the tension was undeniable. By the time they finished, it was 3 a.m. "Stay in the guest wing," Jae-won commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "I'm not having you drive across the city at this hour when your stepfather's fixers are likely prowling the streets." Diamond didn't argue. She was exhausted, but her mind was still spinning. Over the next few days, the guest wing became her secondary war room. She showed Jae-won the back doors she had spent an entire year building into Hanul's logistics servers. She wasn't just a hacker, she was an architect of collapse. While Jae-won handled the physical and social intimidation of the board members, squeezing their credit lines and making them realize that Hanul was a sinking ship, Diamond was the silent blade. She systematically diverted their most lucrative shipping contracts to a new neutral shell company she had registered in the Cayman Islands. Jae-won watched her work from the doorway, a rare sense of respect and growing affection softening his hard exterior. He watched the way her eyes narrowed when she found a vulnerability and the tactical precision of her keystrokes. She was brilliant, cold, and entirely in control. He realized then that her saving him in that rain-slicked alley 3 years ago hadn't been a lucky coincidence or a moment of feminine panic. It had been the instinct of a predator. A woman who saw the world in patterns and knew exactly when to move before anyone else even realized the game had started. He hadn't just found his savior, he had found his equal. The glow of the dual monitors reflected in Diamond's eyes as she worked through the final layer of the Hanul Group's encryption. The silence of her office was broken by the sharp buzz of her phone. The caller ID displayed a name that usually made her stomach turn. Tony. Tony was the first son of her stepfather's house, the Golden Boy, born into a world where his every whim was a command. Though he was younger than Diamond, he carried the suffocating audacity of a male heir who had never been told no. To their stepfather, Diamond was a commodity to be traded, but Tony was the legacy. She didn't pick up. She knew he would send a text. A few seconds later, a text appeared. Diamond, enough of this madness. Dad is beyond furious. I've convinced him to listen, but only if you come home this week and apologize on your knees. Stop this rubbish and come back before you lose everything and regret it. I'm your only hope for mediation. Diamond felt a cold wave of amusement. Tony actually believed he was in a position to offer mercy. He still saw her as the quiet girl who focused on her books while he crashed expensive cars and had the bills disappear. She didn't type a long reply. Instead, she pulled up a folder she had spent months populating. She selected a single screenshot, a detailed breakdown of Tony's offshore accounts in Macau. It showed millions of dollars skimmed from their stepfather's shipping fuel surcharges, all funneled into high-stakes gambling dens. She hit send, adding a single line. The brothers get everything, right? Including the prison sentence when Dad finds out you've been bleeding his accounts dry to cover your losses. Don't text me again. The silence that followed was absolute. Later that evening, as Diamond exited her headquarters toward the parking garage, she was met with a different kind of desperation. Hanul was leaning against a black sedan, his face still bruised from the dinner. Rena stood beside him, draped in a fur coat that looked cheap despite the price tag, her face twisted in a sneer. You think you're a mogul now? Hanul spat, stepping forward. You stole the Joe Group deal. You've humiliated my family. I'm going to make sure no firm in this city touches your software. I'll ruin you, Diamond. Rena let out a sharp, mocking laugh. You're just a little girl playing a big game. You will soon burn. Diamond didn't move. He didn't have to. Behind her, 2 of the guards Jae-won had assigned to her team stepped forward, their presence a wall of dark wool and muscle. They didn't draw weapons, they didn't have to. The air shifted instantly. Listen closely, Hanul, Diamond said, her voice like a sharpening stone. I told you at the Shilla that we were done. If you or your mistress come within 10 feet of me or my building again, I won't be polite. She stepped toward her car, not looking back as Hanul shouted empty threats behind her. She knew they were coming for her, she could feel the desperation in their movements. But as she gripped the steering wheel, Diamond felt no fear. She was ready for whatever they thought was an attack. They were playing with fire, she was the one who controlled the oxygen. The humid night air of Seoul hung heavy over Diamond's residential complex, but inside her house the atmosphere was clinical and chilled. Diamond sat on her sofa, the only light in the room emanating from the 15-inch glow of her laptop. She wasn't looking at code tonight. She was watching a comedy and laughing. Then she heard the noise and quickly switched to the feed of the cameras placed in the surroundings. Her stepfather had finally run out of patience. The chief was a man who viewed the world as a series of assets to be seized, and since Diamond had refused to be a pawn, he had decided to treat her like stolen cargo. The 6 men moving through the shadows of the perimeter didn't look like amateur thugs. They moved with the synchronized low-profile gait of professionals. Men who carried crowbars for the locks and silenced pistols for anything that breathed. They expected a terrified girl hiding under a duvet who would crumble the moment a heavy boot kicked in her door. What they didn't know was that Diamond had stopped being that girl 3 years ago in an alleyway, and she certainly wasn't that girl now that she was partnered with the architect of their doom. 2 days prior, J1 had quietly repositioned a 12-man elite security detail into the neighboring units and the maintenance corridors. He hadn't even asked for her permission. He had simply stated it was a mechanical necessity. Diamond took a slow, deliberate sip of her herbal tea, her eyes never leaving the screen. She watched as the lead intruder reached for the electronic keypad of the main entrance. He didn't even get to input the first digit. From the darkened stairwell and the shadows of the hallway planters, J1's team materialized like ghosts. The efficiency was brutal and silent. There were no shouts, no long-winded struggles. It was a sequence of muffled thuds, precise tactical strikes, and the metallic clatter of dropped weapons hitting the carpet. In under 5 minutes, all 6 men were face down on the floor, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, before they could even draw a breath to scream. Diamond didn't flinch. She didn't feel the rush of adrenaline she expected. Instead, she felt a cold, settling sense of clarity. This was the reality of the world her parents had tried to force her into. She was simply the first one in the family to play the game better than the men. She didn't reach for the phone to call the local precinct. The police were a variable she couldn't control, and Diamond hated uncontrolled variables. Instead, she swiped her screen and opened a direct line to J1. He picked up on the first half ring. "It's done," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that sounded as if he were right in the room. "I saw," Diamond replied, her gaze fixed on the lead intruder, a man she recognized as one of her stepfather's personal security details. A man who had probably carried her bags when she was a child. "Don't hand them over to the authorities yet, J1. I don't want a paper trail until I've extracted the leverage I need." "What do you want to do with them?" "Put them in the basement of the Mapo facility," Diamond said, her voice dropping into a lethal, steady tone. "Secure them. I'm coming down now. I want to talk to them before the sun comes up." The air in the basement of J1's Mapo facility was cold and smelled of damp concrete and motor oil. Diamond entered just as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. She didn't look like a woman who had been awake all night. She looked like an executioner in a tailored wool coat. She walked to the center of the room, where the 6 men were zip-tied to heavy metal chairs, and pulled up a seat directly across from the lead mercenary. She didn't yell or show the flicker of an emotional wound. She simply laid a tablet on a small folding table and swiped it on. The blue light illuminated the mercenary's bruised face as Diamond began scrolling through a series of spreadsheets and encrypted shipping manifests. "You're loyal to Chief Osei's because he pays well," Diamond began, her voice a steady, chilling hum. "But look at the screen. These are the cargo logs for the last decade. My stepfather hasn't just been shipping textiles. He's been using illegal routes to bypass international sanctions. And here," she tapped a different file, "is the paper trail connecting these shipments to Hanul's family firm. Your employers wanted a mutual shield for their smuggling ring." The mercenary remained silent, but his eyes darted toward the screen as Diamond pulled up a high-definition recording of Hanul and her father discussing a cleanup operation involving these very men. "Hanul is already preparing to throw you under the bus," she continued, her tone clinical. "He's filed a police report claiming that rogue elements of his security team acted without authorization. You can go to prison for 20 years for a man who will forget your name by lunchtime, or you can give the Seoul Metropolitan Police the testimony they need to dismantle both of them." She leaned in, her gaze pinning him to his seat. "Either way, they are finished. I've already sent a mirrored copy of this drive to the National Tax Service. The ship is sinking and the lifeboats are reserved for the people who talk first. You just have to decide if you're going to drown for men who wouldn't spend a cent on your bail." The silence in the basement lasted for exactly 60 seconds. Then the lead man cracked. By 9 a.m., the men were in a secure interrogation room, singing to a team of prosecutors. By noon, the coordination was total. A synchronized raid was underway. Diamond stood beside J1 at a window overlooking the city as news footage broke of the Seoul Metropolitan Police storming her stepfather's offices and Hanul's corporate headquarters. The two pillars of her past were collapsing in real time, and Diamond didn't feel a single regret. She was no longer a bargaining chip. She was the one who had cleared the board. The private dinner hall at the Shilla looked exactly the same, yet the air within it had been stripped of its previous toxicity. The scent of expensive truffle oil remained, but the suffocating pressure of Hanul's ego and her stepfather's greed had evaporated. Diamond sat at the long table in the same seat Hanul had occupied when he thought he was the master of her fate. Across from her sat J1. He wasn't obscured by shadows tonight. He sat in the full, unforgiving light of the chandeliers, his eyes anchored on Diamond with a look of profound professional respect. The silence in the room was no longer stunned or fearful. It was the quiet of an empire being born. The world outside these walls had been scorched. Hanul was officially bankrupt, his family's reputation blacklisted by every major firm from Seoul to Singapore. Rena had vanished the moment the credit card stopped working, leaving Hanul to face the debt collectors alone. Her stepfather had his international shipping assets frozen and his golden son, Tund, under house arrest for the very embezzlement Diamond had uncovered. Diamond's phone resting on the tablecloth began to vibrate. Her mother's name flashed across the screen for the 10th time that hour. Diamond watched the light flicker against the wood, knowing the script by heart. The pleas for mercy, the claims of being a victim of the chief's influence, the desperate attempt to regain a foothold in a life of luxury. Diamond didn't reach for it. She didn't feel anger, only a final, cold detachment. She flipped the phone face down, silencing the ghost of her past. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound folder. She slid it across the polished surface of the table toward J1. It was the formal merger between her tech empire and the Joe Group, a partnership that combined the world's most advanced logistics software with the most powerful infrastructure in East Asia. J1 didn't reach for his reading glasses. He didn't flip through the pages of fine print or the meticulously guarded intellectual property clauses. He picked up a fountain pen and signed his name at the bottom of the final page in a single fluid motion. He knew her work. More importantly, he knew the woman behind it. "The debt is finally paid, Diamond," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that filled the room. He closed the folder and pushed it back toward her. "You've cleared the board." Diamond picked up the pen. Her hand didn't tremble as she signed her name, her signature sharp and final. She wasn't the stranger who saved a man in an alley anymore, and she certainly wasn't the bargaining chip her mother had tried to sell. She was a global CEO and a woman who had built her own seat at the table. "I didn't do this to pay a debt, Joan," she said, meeting his gaze with a small, dangerous smile. "I did it to own the market." She stood up, her face blooming in the light. "We're just getting started."